HDR. You all know the look. A quick search on Google will find lots of examples of that super high contrast, super saturated, super gritty look that's kind of the hallmark of an HDR image, but which is actually kind of the opposite of what a real HDR image should look like. Ideally, your client would never suspect that anything has been done. It just looks like a properly exposed image. And if you want that realistic look without that HDR distinctive look to it, you need to take matters into your own hands. And that's what we're going to take a look at right now is manual HDR. The first step is to figure out your exposures. You should have a nice range of exposures from extremely underexposed, capturing all of that nice highlight information in the brightest parts of the image, all the way up to extremely overexposed, capturing all of that nice shadow detail in the darkest parts of the image. Then go into your normal exposure, figure out which one is right in the middle where most of the things in the scene are properly exposed, call it up in Photoshop, and that's going to be your base. You're going to build onto that from there. Each of the exposures is basically going to be a four-step process. First, figure out what the problem is. Second, call up the exposure that will fix that problem. Third, stack it on top. And fourth, paint it back in using a layer mask. So let's go through step one here on this dark part at the top. Looks like it's a little too dark at the top, on the bottom, up the sides here. So to lighten that up, I'm going to use my +1 exposure. So I'll pop back in, grab my +1. There it is as a separate document. There's my normal, there's my +1, and I need to get this layer stacked on top of my normal exposure. There's a few ways you can do it. You could copy and paste. If we went select all, we could choose edit, copy, pop over to our normal exposure, and simply paste it in. And you can see it drops that lighter exposure over top, and I'll name this +1. Always rename as you go, and in fact, I'll call my background, whoops, normal. Once I learn how to type, there we go. Now this +1 here, right now that's all I can see. It's at the top of the stack. If I turn this eyeball off, there's the normal exposure, and there is my +1. I only want it to be visible at the top and the bottom of the image there, maybe a little bit up the side. So I'm going to use a layer mask to hide this +1 layer, revealing only the normal. So I'll give it a layer mask. Right now it's a white layer mask, revealing that. I'm going to invert it, Command-I, nice fast way of filling a layer mask with black, and it is hidden, that +1 exposure. Now I'm going to grab a paintbrush, load her up with some white paint, just hit D on the keyboard to make sure I have my default colors, make sure I'm at 100% opacity. You can use lower opacities if you want a little more of a subtle effect, kind of gradually build it up to what you need it to be. But in this case, I know that I want this +1 exposure, so at 100%, I'm just going to paint some white paint onto that layer mask. Now it's lightening up the image, not because I'm painting with white, but because I'm revealing the +1 exposure. And I can make my way across the image, painting with white to reveal the lighter exposure wherever I need. And in this case, I've chosen an image that has a lot of people in it. I photographed this on the York University campus. There were people everywhere. When you're shooting HDR, try to make sure there's nothing moving in the scene, or you can end up with weird things like this where this lady is following herself up the stairs. You get to decide which layer to keep and which layer to hide. So in this case, I've chosen the lighter exposure. If I had wanted to, watch this, I can take some black paint, which will hide that lighter exposure, and I can bring back the darker version. So by switching back and forth between black and white, we can hide, we can reveal the chosen exposure, until we get the effect we're looking for. Now, next thing I'm thinking, these windows here are a little bit too bright. So I'm going to go through the first step. I've established the problem. This is too bright. Second step, find the image that fixes it. Notice it didn't export the clipboard because it was so large. I'm going to show you another way to copy the layer over in a minute. Here's my -1, and those windows up there look pretty good. So I'll call it my -1 exposure. Duplicate it over to the other document. Last time I copied and pasted. Here's another thing you can do. If I right click on the name background, I can choose duplicate layer. I'll call this one -1. And for the destination, I'm going to choose my normal exposure. This is where we're building everything up. Hit OK. Pop over to my normal exposure. And there's that -1 stacked on top. Again, I'm going to hide it with a layer mask. Give it a layer mask. Invert that layer mask. Grab a paintbrush. Now the last time, you'll notice I used a fairly large, soft brush, nice unnoticeable edge. The problem here is that large, soft brush will leave a noticeable edge. That dark, almost kind of a scorch mark is one of the hallmarks of HDR. that's a fairly hard edge down there. So instead of using a soft brush, if I go too low, we'll get a bit of a light spot along the edge. If I go too high, we get that dark scorch mark. So what I'm going to do is choose a smaller brush with a edge softness about the hardness of the edge of this window here. And I'll simply do a click. Now here's a neat thing. If you hold down the Shift key and click somewhere else, you can see that it jumps between those points. Hold down the Shift key and click. So we can kind of shift click our way around the outside of that window. And sometimes precision is called for, and sometimes a soft brush is called for. In this case, we're going for precision. I'm just cutting my way around the outside of the window. And again, because it's a layer mask, we don't have to worry too much about being overly precise. If we do mess up a little bit, we can always go in and hide our mistakes or add again. Notice I'm switching back and forth between black and white by hitting the X key. There we go. And once we've got this nicely outlined, if we hold down the Option key, click on the layer mask, there's the layer mask itself. Now this inner part I want to fill with white to completely reveal that darker exposure. So I could paint. That would take a long time. Instead, I'm going to grab my magic wand, click inside this area here, and because of this little problematic fringe bit, I'm going to expand this selection. I'm going to go under Select, Modify, Expand, jump this out, say, let's try 4 pixels. Yeah, that'll do. Edit, Fill with white, deselect, Command D, always get rid of your marching ants when you're done with them. There's before, and there's after. So we brought in that darker exposure into the window. And then it's just a matter of continuing on exposure by exposure, bringing in what you need. For example, again, down here at the very bottom, outside this window, there should be some bricks in that little courtyard inside that sidewalk. Can't see those. If, though, I go to my -3 exposure, send it over, duplicate layer, -3, send it to my normal exposure, hide it with a layer mask, grab a paintbrush, some white paint, and I can bring back the proper exposure that has the bricks in there. And that's all there is to it. When you're done, save her up as a layered PSD file, and Bob's your uncle.